Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Rosen. I am the Executive Chairman of Global Go and also the Executive Chairman of Psychedelics Go, our sister company. On behalf of the whole Psychedelics Go team, the Canadian Securities Exchange, and the Psy Index, I want to thank everybody for attending our first ever Psychedelics Now virtual conference. We have an incredible itinerary for this afternoon. We'll just talk a little bit generally about what's happening in the psychedelic industry. I think anyone that's paying close attention over the last year probably is shocked and awed by the expedient development of an industry that a few years ago really did not exist. And I will quote my favorite German philosopher, Schopenhauer, who said that all new ideas go through a three-stage cycle. They are first ridiculed, they are then violently opposed, and then they are seen as self-evident. I think it's fair to say that the entire psychedelic industry has reached very quickly a form of self-evidence, and we're seeing some incredible drug development, some incredible therapies, and some incredible companies being birthed to really help create new, improved, and best-in-class modalities to address a wide variety of mental health conditions. I'll just speak personally for a moment. I'm a 57-year-old Canadian, and I got very interested in psychedelics when I was going to law school at the University of Toronto back in the 1980s. There wasn't yet a lexicon or a vocabulary, but my friends and I would spend most of our weekends ingesting LSD or psilocybin, not microdoses, but what we might call hero doses. And to our mind, we were having incredibly powerful experiences. I myself had suffered abuse as a child and found that the ability to understand myself, my makeup, and to sort of self-heal was incredible, but I couldn't talk to anyone about it because it was so verboten and so kind of controversial. But I have almost perfect recollection of some of those trips from close to 30 years ago. And to this day, they still are some of the underpinnings of the psychological development that I've been able to go through. So I will consider myself a fully adapted evangelist for the development of this industry. With that being said, we're going to get right to our content. Just to remind the audience that today's program is going to take the form of three separate panels. The first panel I'm going to introduce in a moment. The subject of this panel is clearing the haze, what's legal today. This panel is going to take roughly about an hour. And then there's going to be a half-hour breakout session for all participants and attendees to discuss the content that we're about to unpack on this panel. Then at 2:30 Eastern or 11:30 PT, we'll start again on another panel. Links will be provided on the chat button. The second panel is ketamine clinics, do's and don'ts. We have an incredible list of panelists, some of the brightest lights and biggest names in the industry. We'll do the same thing. That'll be an hour panel, and then we'll move to a half-hour breakout. Links will be provided. And then again, at 12:30 Pacific, 3:30 Eastern, will commence our third panel, and our third panel relates to investing in the psychedelic industry, all of which are meaty and really kind of complicated but dynamic topics. So we're super excited to get going. Without further ado, we're going to start our first panel, which is clearing the haze, what's legal today. Over the last couple of years, North America has seen a number of jurisdictions take real concrete steps towards decriminalizing, or even in some instances, contemplating legalizing psychedelic substances, most notably, of course, psilocybin. This is a result of successful voter initiatives in Denver, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Santa Cruz, California, to statewide measures in Oregon. We're starting to see a path towards, in some jurisdictions, psychedelics being decriminalized or even legalized. As people likely know, in 2019, the FDA approved treatment for ketamine-based nasal spray, Spravato, and granted breakthrough therapy designation to 2 psilocybin formulas for depression treatment. So this is happening quickly with the imprimatur of the Food and Drug Administration, and we're going to start to unpack what is legal and what's not legal. Our moderator at today's panel is Dr. Jayashin Mitra, a friend and a colleague of mine. Dr. Mitra focuses on patent litigation, IPR and PGR proceedings, and trade secret matters. She's litigated drug patents for one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world and has experience successfully litigating a diverse range of products in the pharmaceutical and cannabis industries. She's also increasingly focused on the future landscape of litigation in the psychedelic space. Without further ado, I'm so thrilled to announce our moderator, Dr. Mitra. She's too modest, but I'll say Dr. Mitra holds a PhD in pharmacology from Yale University and a JD from Northwestern University. So this is a brilliant left brain, right brain type of personality. And I'm so glad that she's going to take the role of moderator, Dr. Mitra.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm not being modest when I say you're making me blush. But we have an incredible panel today. And if I could ask everyone to turn on their camera, we have Hadas Alterman from Plant Medicine Law Group. We have Tim Moore from Hayden Life, Timothy Cove from Entheon, and we have David Wood from Cygen. I do not need to provide introductions because they are all well known in the industry. And if you do not know them, I would suggest you Google them and you will find out what amazing people they are. But to get right into the business of today's topic, Paul, you just used one of my favorite quotes about how everyone thinks you're crazy and then they wind up thinking you're brilliant. That's the trajectory of my life. But let me ask you, the same thing could be said about the cannabis industry a few years ago. Is psychedelics the new cannabis?
Yeah. Richard, can you take me off mute? I think I'm unmuted, or can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm off. Okay, great. There was a number of points of intersection and there's a number of points of distinction. And so let me just unpack that kind of quickly. What do these industries have in common? Well, I would argue that they're both promoting possible mental health modalities. A lot of people rely upon cannabis to treat anxiety, insomnia, depression, and certainly psychedelics are showing incredible promise to really advance some of those therapies in more profound ways. The differences would be that right now the psychedelic industry is largely a drug development industry. That's where most of the company formations are taking place right now. And I will say that I'm not convinced, or the jury's still out, whether we're going to see a full-blown recreational psychedelic industry the way we're seeing a full-blown adult use cannabis industry. I will argue that cannabis is more naturally inclined to be operating in parallel universes, both drug development as well as adult use or recreational applications. And I'll say psychedelics, while certainly there is a case to be made for the recreational experience of microdosing or even more macrodosing, I see it really turning into much more of a traditional medicine pharmaceutical industry where you have FDA or Health Canada or other health authorities approving medications, and then medical practitioners will be administering those therapies. What makes them a lot alike, though, is that a lot of the capital market participants that helped give birth to the cannabis industry, and I'm talking about the investment banks and the Canadian public exchanges, the CSC and the TSX, they are embracing this as the next great disruptive asset class. And you'll see a lot of the people even speaking today, myself included, came from cannabis and have now sort of moved some of our mind share and our chips from the cannabis industry to the psychedelic industries, because we do see some real similarities, but they are in no way on four corners the same thing.
Which brings me to my next question. In terms of growth trajectory, we have seen an insane explosion of the cannabis industry. The psychedelics, given its more somewhat different scope, shall I say, not limited, but different. What kind of a growth trajectory do you see for it?
I mean, I see I'm not sure if I'm on mute again, hopefully I'm not. I see the growth trajectory in terms of the market cap of the companies is already showing some of those early signs of rapid growth companies. But the difference is the cannabis industry, you can measure the growth not just by the market caps of the companies, but by the revenue that these companies are achieving. We now have several companies in cannabis that are looking at, have pro forma revenue estimates for this year of $1 billion and up. And there is certainly no psychedelic company that's going to get anywhere near that type of revenue in the years to come, in my opinion, because there's just not the total addressable market for recreational consumers that there is right now in cannabis. So I see the market cap of these companies already experiencing high growth. A Thai pharmaceutical as the most recent example, Compass, MindMed, we're seeing companies now, some of which already have billion-dollar market caps, but they're all pre-revenue. Whereas the cannabis companies, and some of them are still pre-positive earnings, but they're mostly growing their revenue meaningfully quarter upon quarter, year upon year. So the high growth would be in terms of the market cap of the companies, but not in terms of the revenue they'll be able to achieve in the short to midterm.
And that is an excellent segue into the next theme we have. And Hadas, we'll be taking the questions to you. Market growth and legalization, they go hand in hand. So, where are we in the legalization landscape, whether it's federal or at the state level in the United States?
Sure. So I'll address this question tier by tier. And there are, of course, at the federal level, FDA clinical trials in process. And I'm sure that someone from the life sciences camp will speak to that. So I won't spend too much time there, but I do want to touch on right to try, and specifically Ames v. DEA. So as you all may know, one of the groups of FDA clinical trial participants is that of terminally ill cancer patients who suffer simultaneously from depression and anxiety. And psilocybin therapy for this particular subset has been wildly successful in treating their anxiety and depression symptoms, or I think as many people would say, what's actually being treated is the root cause thereof, which is the existential suffering that comes with knowing you're going to die painfully soon. So in any case, as the fabulous people at MAPS will tell you, clinical trials take a lot of time, and rightfully so. But time is not a luxury that people who are terminally ill have. So that's where right to try comes in. And particularly the work of attorney and Wonder Woman, Catherine Tucker, to open psilocybin access to these terminal patients, even though the clinical trials have not yet run their full course. So under right to try laws, if you have someone in a terminal state who would like to try an experimental drug that does not have FDA approval yet, and they live in a state with right to try laws, they've exhausted all of their other options in Western medicine, and so them as the patient and their doctor can apply for permission to utilize an investigational drug like psilocybin. And Gary Smith, who is another attorney in the space and the author of Psychedelics, described right to try as a legal Hail Mary. So Catherine is currently representing an oncology clinic and the physicians and patients thereof in a lawsuit against the DEA, seeking to compel the agency to apply right to try to psilocybin so this physician can obtain the substance and offer it to terminally ill patients in order to relieve their existential suffering. One of the really exciting things about Ames is that it could set precedent for patients nationwide. The petitioner's opening brief was just filed in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals about a month ago. And I recommend, if this sounds interesting to you, I recommend following Catherine Tucker on LinkedIn, seeing what she's up to with this as it moves forward, because I think it's a very important niche issue that affects some of the most vulnerable stakeholders in this space. All right, so let's move on to talking about state level work. I'm gonna start with New York. The most interesting recent development there, I think, is that Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal introduced a bill during the legislative session that just ended that would require the state to establish an institute to research the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. So the institute would be mandated to investigate the medical potential of substances like ibogaine, LSD, psilocybin in the treatment of addiction for people suffering with a substance use disorder, including meth, opioids, and other addictive substances. So researchers would be required to coordinate clinical trials, develop training programs to 4 professionals who are going to be conducting the research, and establish an advisory board for oversight. So one of the things I think is very interesting about this bill is that it stipulates that if state regulators are unable to obtain the requisite amounts of psychedelics through a licensing agreement with the DEA, due to the agency's refusal or failure to cooperate with New York's program, they have to contract with a facility with the available source, the substance, and obtain the drugs without a DEA license. So that's fun. And we'll see what happens. Like I said, New York legislative session is over, but I think that there's definitely more to be seen with this bill next session. So California, Senate Bill 519 would decriminalize personal use and possession and social sharing of psychedelic substances. And there was a pretty historic Senate vote on June 1st. It advanced this legislation. It's the most expansive psychedelic policy reform to pass through a state chamber. It doesn't decriminalize sale, but it explicitly allows for the sale of services that are adjacent to the sharing of the substance. For example, a person could legally pay to go on a retreat. So they'd be paying for room and board, instructors' fees, therapist fees, and they would also be consuming psychedelics, but that transaction would be merely incidental to paying for the retreat itself, or the ceremony itself, or the therapy itself. So it creates a lot of space for different transactions to legally occur. Possession and use and sale of drug analysis kits would also be decriminalized. And the model also mandates a research committee that would be tasked with researching a more robust legalization framework later. And then last thing, I'll just talk about Oregon. Oregon is amazing. The voters passed the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, which legalizes the use of psilocybin products through licensed therapeutic centers. They're not clinics, which I'll talk more about later. They're therapeutic centers. So that means this includes ceremony, mediation, alternative modalities of healing. All of this still needs to be fleshed out in the regulations, but the potential is there legally. And also not all administrators of the substances will be doctors. There's discussion right now of having 2 different tiers of participants. So you go in for a screening. If it's clear that some sort of condition you have requires you to see a physician to, administer psilocybin, then you'll be sort of funneled off in that direction. But I think for most people, they'll be able to just go and see whatever licensed person under the state's program they want to receive the therapy. And then of course, Oregon's also passed Measure 110, which makes non-personal possession of a controlled substance no more than a Class E violation, which is like an $100 fine. And then cities, there's various decriminalization measures. I don't know that I have time to get too far into them. But most of these measures don't actually change the law. They just change the enforcement of the law in decriminalizing psychedelics, which I think makes what's happening at the state level in California all that much more meaningful, because it's actually a change to the law, not just in how the police essentially are going to regard the law and people breaking it.
I have one follow-up question before I move on. What you said about the research aspect, as we know in cannabis, one of the big strangleholds on research for medical purposes has been the supply chain.
Yeah.
And do you feel that what we learned in the cannabis industry is going to help free up the supply chain to facilitate medical research? Because as Paul pointed out, that's where this industry is likely to be going in the near future.
I hope so. It's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that sourcing when it comes to research and dealing with the hall of mirrors that is the DEA and the FDA is incredibly complicated. And I think that that's why Assemblymember Rosenthal had her bill drafted with that particular provision, saying that the holdup cannot be the DEA's refusal to comply, because it shouldn't be. And it winds up being a technicality that stops progress from moving forward. And ultimately you're hurting patients, and you're hurting patients that need this research to be done. And I would say, just a big we all owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Sue Sisley, who's been fighting this battle with the DEA and vis-a-vis cannabis for years. So yeah, I do think that she's certainly helped make us more aware of this problem and to anticipate where it may arise and be prepared for that. And just the one other thing I'll say is that, you know, in helping with the regulatory process for Oregon, I hear a lot of people talking about these centers as clinics and clinical data and clinical trials. And I actually think one of the things that's really interesting about the data we might get from Oregon is the fact it's not clinical data, right? Like what the FDA is, what people doing those clinical trials are discovering about these drugs pertain to what happens in a clinical setting. It's not, you know, this is what happens when you take MDMA with your friends or take mushrooms in ceremony. If we wanted to know that stuff, I would just go take a straw poll at Coachella or something. It would be like cheaper and more fun. But I think that we will be able to start getting information like that out of Oregon, where people are using these substances in a lot of different settings. And I think that'll be interesting and ultimately very beneficial.
And that's a great transition to Tim Moore from Haven Life. Tim, you know, we've been talking about how the industry is growing, how, you know, the promise and the future hope. Why now? Why are we thinking about it now? Psychedelics were there in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then they imploded, and now they're back. So why are we seeing this resurgence, do you think?
I think we're seeing several what I'll call tectonic forces coming together to create this opportunity. The first is mental health. We know that, you know, a significant percentage of the population has mental health issues. That's only going to grow. I believe we're going to see an echo pandemic from COVID because of the significant number of people that have had, you know, profound effects on them. It's at a scale that I feel we haven't seen since World War II, with millions of people, whether they lost their job, lost a business, lost a loved one, couldn't visit somebody in the hospital, couldn't have a funeral, had their wedding canceled, or just were locked up with people they didn't want to be with. You know, there's been a lot of things that have happened, and we can't expect that to go without consequence. Or the first line responders, our medical responders that have been in battlefield conditions for over a year now. And, you know, I ask people, when was the last time we built temporary morgues? And it's not in my lifetime that I can remember. So we can't, you know, you think of what happened to physicians in war conditions. I think we're going to see the same thing from, you know, our medical community, or people that work in long-term care facilities where they had a significant percentage of their residents die in a very short period of time. So all of that, and then there's the actual consequences of the survivors. I mean, people like Chris Cuomo that have now been diagnosed with depression as a result of COVID. So we're going to see an echo pandemic. So I think mental health as an issue is a mega trend. The second is the attitude towards mental health. It wasn't that long ago that we called these people crazy and we put them in asylums and sanatoriums and didn't think about them, right? And in relative terms, Cuckoo's Nest wasn't that long ago. So, you know, that has evolved really significantly, where the stigma around mental health has changed. It's now okay to not be okay. I can tell people I'm being treated. I can say, hey, I've got anxiety and I'm seeing a therapist. That wasn't the case that long ago. So the destigmatization and the ability to talk about mental health is allowing more people to come forward and talk about those issues. And I think those two things are being recognized by policymakers that are saying, we need to deal with this. So you're seeing the compassionate use exemptions that are being granted in an accelerated way. And that will include the need for the policymakers to approve a safe and reliable supply, so we don't drive people to the street. I mean, you know, the war on drugs was really a war on patients, right? We've heard that before, and there's all these sad statistics that come out of that. I mean, whether, you know, I'm in British Columbia, and last year in British Columbia, we had more opioid overdose deaths than we had COVID deaths, and we didn't shut the economy down for opioids. So, you know, there's a big issue there. Or among our veterans, we've had more veterans commit suicide than died in Afghanistan, and there's no parade when they commit suicide. So there's a need there. Regulators are recognizing it. That's evolving quickly, and that's creating this opportunity today for us to come in with what I feel is the industry of hope. The ability to provide people with a solution that allows them to live their lives, to wake up in the morning, look forward to the day, to spend time with a significant other, to look forward to a vacation. Because right now, the sad reality is that most people that are suffering from anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance abuse, the best they can hope for today is to find their combination of activities or chemicals that allow them to get numb enough to get through the day. And I feel that road leads to suicide far too often. So we offer the promise as an industry to get people back to normal to live their lives. That's what's presenting this opportunity.
And you
Can
have
I just jump in and say, I think I just am obligated to say, first of all, that's incredible. Because I think the war on drugs was first and foremost a race war and a culture war, and the patients were the collateral damage of that war, not the direct target.
Yeah, I agree.
actually, my dissertation was on prenatal exposure to cocaine, and I was surprised to find it didn't really have much of an effect. But that's a story for a different day. So Tim, you have your background is in building industries, and somebody trying to enter the psychedelic industry is intimidating. There are numerous psychedelics, different entry points. You do not know what the growth trajectory is going to be, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So tell us, if you're entering the industry, what do you look for?
Well, first of all, you got to be prepared for the long haul. You have to be prepared to deal with the stigma. I mean, we went through, when we were dealing with FINRA to get our DTC eligibility last year, we got treated like we were Walter White making crystal meth in the basement of a laundry facility. I mean, they really gave us grief over that. And ultimately, I mean, this is oversimplification, but what I said to them was, look, when Pfizer creates a new heart drug, it's just as illegal as psilocybin until the FDA approves it. And that they finally went, oh yeah, we get it. Because, we've talked about the state federal tension, which doesn't exist. And I think that's great. Everything that we as an industry are doing is in compliance with the FDA or Health Canada. We're following the rules. It's a very narrow road. It's a difficult road. And if you're entering this industry, be prepared to deal with a narrow, complicated road where everything is hard. Everything you want to do is hard. I mean, we spent 4 months waiting for a DEA license for an animal study. I mean, it's craziness. So, and then you're right. I mean, the road to revenue can be a long one. We're looking at a different path because we're going to be a supplier to people that are doing the studies. But if you're working on, developing an API, you've got to ask shareholders to hold their breath for quite a while. So you need to have people that are committed when they invest their money, that understand what the risk is and how long that road is. So yeah, just be prepared for something that isn't easy to do, lots of complexity, and the stigma that gets attached with people accusing you of being a drug dealer.
Well, talking about being accused of being a drug dealer, do you feel US is going to be taking the lead in developing the research platform and the acceptance in this area, or do you see other countries far ahead of the game? And that's where we will be seeing more of the groundbreaking research emerge.
Yeah, I think that the US will probably be one of the leaders. I mean, we've seen, and Paul mentioned recreational. I personally think that we're not going to see anytime soon dispensaries in the US or Canada where you can walk in and buy mushrooms and go home and have a party. I think it's going to be a medical solution with the appropriate prescriptions and controls and et cetera. So, but I think the US is going to be a leader. I think there's going to be a recognition around the scope and scale of the mental health issues that aren't being properly addressed. Ultimately, the public is going to have some degree of outrage over suicide rates. I don't think we can expect people to continue to be quiet about that. All of the various substance abuse issues we deal with, the cost, the billions that are spent on treatment for anxiety and depression today, the billions of lost productivity, it can't be ignored. So yeah, I think that just given the size of the economy, and I think COVID was a good test for that. When COVID was identified as a pandemic crisis, we saw accelerated access to vaccines. I think we could probably see the same kind of accelerated access to psychedelic assisted therapy once the government accepts mental health as a crisis.
And when we are talking about development of treatments, supply chain, which is something that you mentioned, that becomes very critical. Here we have numerous different molecules derived from very different sources. They can be synthetics, they can be naturally derived. And there is, I think, scope in the industry for crosstalk between the people pursuing different molecules and different types of API. How do you see this crosstalk developing?
Well, even within any one product, you can still see that. So if you take psilocybin mushrooms as an example, there's hundreds of chemicals in the mushroom. I think it's naive to believe that it's only the psilocybin that has an effect on the brain. And people that have taken naturally derived or synthetic, have taken both, they'll say it's a very different experience. So within any one plant, you already see that issue. You know, and then with the ayahuasca, you've got hundreds of different formulas. It's village by village. So I think, you know, I think there's going to be opportunity there for people to find these synergistic combinations, whether it's within one where you go between isolate and what I'll call broad spectrum, to use the cannabis metaphor, or if it's using more than one compound. And I think that there is going to be promise there. I mean, it's we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about how the brain works. So I think as we you know do more and more research to understand the chemistry of the brain and the consequences of using these different chemicals, that we'll identify these. And the amount of research that's going on, and I think it's wonderful how creative people are being in the things that they're researching, because we will learn a lot and there'll be some new modalities developed. And I remind people all the time, this is different than heart medication. I mean, with a heart medication, you measure my blood pressure, you give me the pill, you measure my blood pressure. It's binary. Did it work? Yes or no. With mental health, it's really hard. I mean, you got to deal with the person's living environment, their coping mechanisms, you know, other things that are going on in their life. And then ask the question, how anxious are you now? How anxious are you now? How anxious are you now? Just asking me the question makes me anxious, you know. So it's difficult, and I think that we've got a long road ahead of us. Again, back to what's the complexity in this industry and the challenge. It's hard to come up with confirmation that what you're doing is really working, and how well it's working. So be prepared.
And from that, there we go to Timothy Cove of Entheon. And Timothy, that segue is just tailor made for you, because we need to understand. We need to understand how these molecules are working, how we present the benefits to patients, to clinicians, to the population, and to politicians, if we are going to make this industry what it's capable of being. And that's where I think you are a thought leader. So do you want to give us an overview of where we are on scientific research and the thought processes driving it?
Certainly. And I think it's really important to note that though so much of the interest of the last few years does seem very sort of novel, it is in a spectrum or a continuation of this sort of like expansion contraction that you know, began many decades ago, pre sort of Controlled Substances Act, where we did go from this very sort of like expansive esoteric research just to better understand the nature of consciousness, to the ultimate sort of vilification and sort of reflexive shutting down. And, you know, where we stand now is that, you know, I think in the absence of psychedelics, we've seen the conventional pharmacological approaches to treating things like mental health and addiction just fail so miserably that, you know, there's nothing really to stem the tide. And so I think just in a more general context to the points of everyone that's spoken so far, you know, I love that there is this sort of groundswell of interest, both on a sort of rec use, cognitive liberty level, as well as, you know, the general awareness pushing legislators and law writers to, you know, lawmakers don't move unless pushed. And I think this is a reflection of this notion that people are now demanding access to these things. But, you know, I think a really important takeaway of some of the legislative processes that are taking right now is that in most cases, there is an association with a adjunct type of therapy or explicitly for the purposes of research. And I do think that as much as I'm a believer in cognitive liberty, as much as, you know, psychedelics are viewed as this, we're in this new expansion phase about, oh, you know, the novelty, the sort of panacea potential of this to just treat any and all things. You know, these are non-specific amplifiers, and there is a case to be made for, in the inappropriate populations, there is a potential for, you know, things we hear such as psychedelic narcissism, amplifications of, you know, certain character components or narrative components that, if not adequately integrated or supported, can actually have a detrimental or counterproductive effect. And so, long way of saying, you know, I'm really excited by what's happening right now, but I do think, you know, as we move away from the obviously the over vilified stigma of the past. You know, what we do see in terms of the research that's taking place is a movement more from or away from the observational and into the highly sort of controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled, well-structured studies that, you know, look obviously at the safety on a pure pharmacological level, but also efficacy. And then going beyond that, I think, as Tim mentioned, there's so much to be learned. You know, this isn't like heart medication where there is a sort of a binary measuring of results where, you know, we see an individual takes this medication, their blood pressure drops. There is a complex biology perspective here, as well as the complex I guess, brain networks perspective that is responsible for dictating, you know, what is the specific mechanism of a psychedelic in terms of eliciting this transformational experience that's so important. So, you know, a lot of the work that we're doing at Entheon is to, of course, follow the measure or the standard of the very sometimes arduous and necessarily arduous and cost-intensive regulatory pathway. But in doing so, you know, we are trying to, you know, for the benefit of our own research, but as well as the entirety of the psychedelic community, really get an understanding about, okay, these molecules, we all know that there's this effect that's so positive. What is actually taking place on the brain level that can be can explain what some of these dramatic and profound changes are? And so that's some of the research that we're doing, aside from just the pure basic chemistry research, receptor binding stuff. We are looking at these complex sort of brain systems and seeing what activations take place, what neural networks are engaged as we move from this this idea of the sort of the pathological or habitual. What specific feature of entropy is employed that, you know, results in this move towards criticality, and in what areas of the brain does this shift in entropy related criticality take place, so that we could measure where the sort of necessary areas of effect are. And as we can empiricize these things, then we can start validating this notion that, hey, you know, a therapeutic effect looks like this from a brain level. And then once we have that established paradigm, then we're able to also track, measure, and validate the efficacy of these molecules. So yeah, I think, you know, in general, the psychedelic industry is moving towards this level of empiricism. And I know that there might be pushback and people say, oh, you know, if you know where God exists within the brain, then do you effectively kill God? I don't subscribe to that. I do think it's, I think these are fundamentally important questions about what the core symbols and sort of narrative features of us as humanity share. And I think it's just absolutely interesting to, that, you know, psychedelics give us the ability to explore not only what can be hugely beneficial to populations that are absolutely in need, in our case, addiction populations, but in doing so, you know, diving into the core material of what makes a human human. So yeah, we're super excited to be, you know, validating that psychedelics are safe to use, but also learning specifically what they do so as to add to our better understanding of how, you know, what core piece of humanity needs to be addressed to rectify, reconcile, and live a fulfilled life. But in doing so, hopefully adding to this broader base of knowledge for the world to understand what it means to be human.
Thank you so much, Timothy. And before I get to David, I have one last question for you. A lot of the lead in the research is now being taken by the industry. At least that's my perception. Do you see this trend continuing, that the leadership has to come from the industry, or do you see research institutions becoming more open to do more research in this area and adding to the knowledge base that we need to move it forward?
Yeah, I think it's a attack on all fronts. Obviously, on the industry side, you know, revenue opportunities exist where there is unmet need. And so for us, given the sort of current paradigm that is addiction treatment, there's this huge price point with very low levels of efficacy. And from a personal perspective, I lost a brother to addiction 2 years ago in March. There is this anguishing sort of untold human cost that comes from not addressing these things. So from the industry perspective, it is a very easy sort of population to identify as not being adequately addressed. And so from our side, you know, we do see not only a need, but an opportunity to address those things in a way that is potentially more cost effective and certainly more effective than the currently available treatments. that being said, so industry obviously has its incentives and reasons. There's often a merger of the very highly personal as well as the profit motivated. And I think those two things can coexist. On the researcher side, or on the sort of government funded or academic side, we're seeing a Cambrian explosion of interest. And we're constantly being, proposed research opportunities at various academic institutions. And there are different paths to take with different IP and overhead implications, but certainly, we are seeing this emergence. And I don't think that's unusual. I do think, as we build this sort of common knowledge base of proposed effects, proposed areas of efficacy, this is the new frontier. I think, the mind is the only remaining frontier of exploration, and there's so much to be found that I think it is happening on all levels. And so we are in very interesting times.
That's fantastic. And that takes me to David Wood, who is a scientist, an attorney, and also at the forefront of the psychedelic revolution. David, you've heard all the speakers today. We know what an exciting industry it is, that it's a difficult and narrow path. And the question is, sitting where you are, if you had to give input to an investor, what the checklist almost, we have to start somewhere. What's a checklist of haves and must-haves that you would want to see in a company that you're going to be investing in? What is it that you would want to put on that list?
Yeah, thank you, and really happy to be here. It's been fascinating to listen to everyone speak. This is great. So I guess a couple things in general, and then but the biggest one to me is, as Paul pointed out, this is not cannabis. I mean, the parallels are easy to spot culturally, but not in terms of the business opportunity, and not in terms of how people use it. I mean, it's common to use cannabis on a regular basis. It's, in my experience at least, far less common to use psychedelics on a regular basis. And so what's really important is to make sure that if you're investing in a company, think about companies who win whether or not the law changes. And if you're going to err on one side, assume it won't change. Because, I mean, I live in Canada. I bought this at a store and paid tax on it. Like, cannabis is just legal here, but it's not a drug product. You can buy cannabis products medically, still consumer packaged goods that have no health claims on them. They're just stuff that might help people if a doctor thinks it will. Psychedelics could end up being available through some sort of medical access system like that in Canada. That's not outside the realm of possibility, like what we're seeing in Oregon, if I understand it correctly. But what will happen for sure with psychedelics, and Timothy's company is part of this, and so is Tim's, is there will be drugs with drug identification numbers that have health indications, that have gone through clinical trials, and that have can be sold and prescribed and covered by insurance. So I'd say really bet on companies that win in that environment. And I think we have three different great examples here. I mean, Entheon is a drug development company. Cygen is much more focused on supply chain. And if I understand Haven correctly, they're kind of in both of those categories. So those are three business plans that work, whether or not we ever have a per se medical access market. And again, this thing is not a box of pills with a health indication and precise dosing. If I buy the same product again 6 months from now, it might be pharmacologically different. And that's okay, because it's just a consumer packaged good that happens to have particular controls on it. Pharmaceuticals, as you probably know better than any of us, Jay, you have to make them the same every time. And it's just a different commercialization path. So whether or not we see a per se medical access system for, say, I think the easiest one to wrap our heads around is psilocybin for psilocybin products, like we're going to see in Oregon, or not, there will be pharmaceuticals. And I think it'll be inverted relative to cannabis. I think even if that kind of system ends up existing, then predominantly I think it'll remain pharmaceutical. And as more than one person's recognized, cannabis is cannabis. It can look different depending on what kind of product you're interested in. But psychedelics, I mean, you could formulate psilocybin in a number of different ways and it'd be psilocybin every time. But when we say psychedelics, I mean, probably psilocybin is the most common one for people to think about, but for me, the first one that comes to mind is LSD. And for other people, it might be dimethyltryptamine, or if you consider it a psychedelic, MDMA. It's a lot of different chemicals. Some of them are synthesized in organisms. Some of them are purely synthetic. Some are very low abundance and are generally synthesized but present in nature. So it's as everyone's kind of recognized, a different kind of proposition to say, let's regulate psychedelics or let's decriminalize psychedelics than cannabis. But that hasn't stopped California. And I mean, the fact that you're going to be able to have retreats in California, I mean, that could be big business. It will be if it happens. But that, again, that's betting on a business model that today doesn't exist. And I guess I'm more conservative and in my choice to join Psygen, that I'm with a company that has a business plan that fits in the current laws. And then another thing I'd say is, and this is trite, but look at the people. You know, I mean, a big reason I joined this company is because a lot of the people involved, Danny Matika, the CEO, Peter Vanderheyden, the chief science officer, like they're people who've been, like myself, interested in moving a better approach to psychedelics than prohibition forward. And I like to say that there are no illegal drugs. There's no such thing as an illegal drug. Treason is illegal. Murder, per se murder, not self-defense, which is a homicide, that's illegal. Theft, illegal. Drugs aren't illegal. They're controlled, which means you can't have them. And I would not be able to buy this thing in the US in compliance with federal law. It's prohibited because it's a controlled substance. But the Mississippi Marijuana Project has cannabis, then they're allowed to, and plenty of labs in the States and in Canada have access to, authorization to manufacture psychedelics or other controlled substances. They just have to follow rules, like a lot of rules. And so it's not, to me, a question of do we legalize things or change the law. There's a framework that this can be done in. It's very narrow, it exists, and a different framework might exist. And it's good to bet on companies that are going to win if that happens too. And that's where I like the culture at Psygen, and I'm sure it's the same at many of these companies, where people who are committed on a personal level to just society doing better on this topic are going to be operating in a way that could pivot into opportunities like that. Because to me, it's about increasing access. And the most direct, it's not simple, but it's probably the most simple way to do that is getting a drug product approved. And, Hadass talked a lot about the States. In Canada, we've got several dozen people now that the federal government, because in Canada, we don't have provincial criminal law. All criminal law is federal. The federal government's given a few dozen Canadians authorization to possess psilocybin, to either use it for their own medical purposes, or far more interestingly to me, that's good that happened. And if only one thing happened, it had to be that. But it's very interesting to me that they've approved many healthcare providers to use psilocybin for training and to better understand what they're offering people. And the company TheraSil, which is a nonprofit, is making big strides in that. That encourage, I'm sure everyone here knows kind of generally about their work. But what's happening there is to me, again, just another indication that we might see changes in the law, because it started this way with cannabis. And like cannabis, it's unfortunate that most of those people, well, all of them, to my knowledge, who apply for exemptions are forced to source it from an illicit source or contravene the law themselves by growing it. So the three things I'd look for: a company that wins without a change in the law, a company that wins better with a change in the law, and a company with a team that knows how to take it to both those places. Because you win by being good at what you do. Liking drugs isn't a skill, but if you are sympathetic to the overall need to do better with controlled substances, bearing in mind I live in a country where I can have this, that's the kind of mindset that's probably going to be able to pivot dynamically and really capitalize on changes in the law if they ever happen.
David, one last question for you before we do a quick wrap up. Both you and Paul have touched on a very critical issue. Everything is illegal, technically speaking. I should use the word everything is not approved until it is approved. And the companies that have a lot of history in knowing how to get products approved are the traditional pharmaceutical companies. And there is a history of Sandoz being the first to create the artificial psilocybin and getting patents on it. Do you see traditional pharma coming into this area, or do you see this something that really is going to be built out by the pioneers, small companies? And when and if something big happens, we'll see more interest from big pharma.
I think it'll be pioneers for now, right? Because too big pharma, even the largest participants in this space are, not all that big. I mean, there's even one that pokes fun at that with their name. But I think that we'll see products brought to market in kind of two categories. And we all have examples that we've met that have gone one way or the other. One is I need a new chemical entity because I'm not going to work with something where I cannot patent the molecule. And we're seeing that. There's many different brand new psychedelic drugs being tested right now. And then the other one is this weird curveball that this sector of the pharmaceutical industry has, which is that we have LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and MDMA. Those ones for sure. I think mescaline and 2CB might be right after those. But those drugs all have a lot of potential to help people and already have helped a ton of people and will help more people. But they can't be patented as a molecule. And then double curveball, you have the first product in this kind of class being brought to market by a public benefit corporation with no patents whatsoever on it, to my knowledge anyway. That's the only time I've ever heard of that happening. So I think we'll see these kind of different pharmaceutical companies bring the classical psychedelics to market. I think larger pharmaceutical companies will be, and I don't know, I haven't worked with those kind of companies nearly as much as you have, so maybe I'd be interested to hear what you think. But to me, they'd be more interested in a market where they can own a patent that monopolizes the molecule itself. And then it gets into an interesting debate of, well, okay, we have psilocybin over here. It costs this much. We have your new molecule with far less safety data over here. It's got some benefit that you've proven out in a clinical trial. It costs a lot more. I don't know what a physician is going to prescribe. Right? Are they going to prescribe the lower cost thing that people have used in incredibly irresponsible conditions with actually fewer problems than you'd think? That, I don't want to use the word safe. Shogun said there is no safe drug. I agree with that. But it's, if you have the choice as a physician to prescribe something that we know a lot about because it's been studied intensively since just after World War II, or something brand new that no human on earth has taken more than 5 years ago and costs 10 times as much, but maybe lasts less duration or has some perceived benefit, I don't know. So I guess it like anything, it depends. But I think, to answer briefly, probably with new chemicals, that'll be more interesting to larger pharmaceutical companies who have the marketing ability to make sure that doctors understand the benefits of their products. I think the classical ones will be brought to market kind of by companies that are probably already well on the road, like MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, Compass, and Usona. And Entheon, of course.
And Paul, as the host, I'm going to ask you to kind of pull all the threads together. You mentioned in the beginning capital market investment in this industry. Where does where do the investors really see the industry going in terms of, we have seen that there are challenges in protecting IP, which is a very critical part. That's not to say we can't protect IP. I'm an IP lawyer, really creative about protecting IP. We do have a huge market that's there, like it or not, patent protection or not. There is a huge untapped market that's waiting. Uh, there is potential for innovative expansion in ways that we've not seen before. From the perspective of those bringing the multi-million-dollar checks to the table, what are they looking for?
Yeah. I mean, anyone that writes a check is looking for a return on their capital, period. They may have other altruistic objectives. I think we could say this is an ESG category, meaning that you're investing, but you're investing specifically because you're concerned about the environment, social or governance. So this fits in my opinion, very much within the ESG thesis. But ESG investors are still investors. They're still seeking alpha, if you will. Otherwise, they'll make philanthropic donations to causes that are near and dear to them. I think it's virtually impossible at this nascent stage to tie all these threads together. At least it's beyond my cognitive abilities. My brain cannot do that because it's really shape-shifting so quickly. I mean, this is really moving at the speed of creativity, the speed of entrepreneurship. One thing, though, I think we can agree upon as an industry is that we do see what is the destination. The destination is going to be a number of transformative, approved by regulated health authorities, modalities that are going to forever change the treatment of the most pervasive global illness, which is mental illness. And when you combine all of the different types of mental illness, whether it's anxiety, depression, insomnia, PTSD, eating disorders, et cetera, I'm going to argue that your total addressable market is bigger than almost any other healthcare need there is. As crazy as it is, bigger than heart disease or bigger than cancer. Not that it's a competition. What we really want to do is eradicate these illnesses as much as possible. But mental health, I'm going to say, is going to be the most intractable. And the research that is now peer-reviewed and reaching critical mass is so promising. We're talking about people that have been suffering for years to decades, that have cycled through every conventional psychiatric therapy available, and I have firsthand experience through family members that just simply could never get relief. And had those family members been able just to do a single session of ketamine or psilocybin with some guardrails around them, I think it would have had a profound impact on their wellness and on their life. And so that's going to happen. But which are the companies that are going to most benefit? This is like trying to handicap a horse race that hasn't even begun yet. You can look and evaluate, but the truth is we're not betting here, but it's not yet clear which companies are going to really, if you will, ring the bell. There's a lot of heat around companies like Compass, Maps, Atai, using some Canadian examples. I'm not even singling out. I'll just name them because I don't want to start making it seem like those are the only companies. But even with those companies, not one of them has yet got a clear path towards monetizing their IP portfolio. They're still in the drug development industry. And Jay, you know this probably better than anyone here. This is the highest risk category there is of drug development, because you can spend literally hundreds of millions, even sometimes billions of dollars, and at the end fail in phase 3, and that's it. That capital really cannot be recouped and sort of shape-shifted into another type of modality. So this, to me, as an investor and as an entrepreneur, I always shied away from drug development because of the risk return was just so scary to me. But no doubt, some of these companies, probably all of which already have some recognition right now, are going to end up becoming behemoths, in my opinion. They're going to have a portfolio of IP that's either going to get sold to big pharma or they're going to become like big pharma. And I think right now we're at such a nascent stage that the best thing any investor can do is to educate themselves, evaluate, use every due diligence trick they have, but also understand that at some point they are essentially deciding which names on their bingo card they want to punch right now, and they don't have the same degree of certainty about outcomes they would in a more conventional industry, which is why this is showing up for investors at the farthest reaches of their risk portfolio. On the other hand, cannabis very much was subject to the same dynamics, and look how well it has done as an industry for both investors and participants. So I think we can look at a map, we can say, here is the destination, inevitably we're going to get there, but it's very difficult to figure out exactly how to get from here to there, or which boat to ride, which plane to fly on. But ultimately, we can say for sure where this is going to be unequivocally, incontrovertibly, the most powerful modalities for intractable mental health illnesses in the history of the world. And that's going to create investment and business opportunities alongside of it.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone, David, Timur, Tinatiko, Hadas. This has been an amazing discussion, and I can see on my chat the link to the breakout room where I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting conversations. Thank you. You've been a great audience and a great panel, and it's been a pleasure to be the host.
Jay, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. Just as I now have to become the host again, just as a matter of housekeeping, yes, the breakout has been posted on the chat. I remind everybody that in 27 minutes, we're going to start our next panel discussion, which is, I think, going to be equally fascinating. And that is ketamine clinics, do's and don'ts. We have an incredible all-star list of participants. Just want to quickly thank our sponsors, without whom today would not be possible: Psychedelics Today, Global Go, the Canadian Securities Exchange, Zuber Lawler, CFN Media Group, and PsyIndex. So thanks so much to our sponsors, thanks to our attendees, and mostly thanks to our incredible content providers for a fascinating, stimulating discussion. See you soon.
See you all.